The woman was abandoned by her husband right after their wedding ceremony. When she got home, she was shocked by what she saw in her bedroom. Brenda was born in a small rural town, far from the hustle and bustle and the opportunities offered by large metropolitan areas. Her childhood was marked by the simplicity and quiet life she led with her family. Her father worked as a public servant, and her mother, a dedicated homemaker, took care of Brenda and her two younger siblings. From an early age, Brenda showed a natural curiosity about the world around her, but unlike other children, she was not the type to stand out in class or strive to be the top student. In school, Brenda was always an average student. Although she was not brilliant, she had a logical reasoning ability that allowed her to easily understand more technical subjects, especially those involving numbers. Mathematics, in particular, had always been her favorite subject. She loved the way numbers worked. This love for numbers was what later led her to choose her professional path. When Brenda was 17, her life underwent a significant change. Her father received a job offer in another city, a slightly larger city with more opportunities than the small town they lived in. The new job promised a better salary and improved living conditions for the family, so without hesitation, they decided to move. For Brenda, the move was difficult. Leaving behind her childhood friends and familiar surroundings was painful, but she understood the importance of this new opportunity for everyone's future. In the new city, Brenda had to adjust to a new school, new classmates, and a new pace of life. Although she was shy and reserved, she soon adapted to the new routine. By the time she finished school, she already had a clear idea of what she wanted to do with her life. Her love for numbers led her to choose a career in accounting. She enrolled in the local college and began to focus on studying accounting, diving into a world where numbers were more than just equations, they were the key to understanding and organizing the workings of businesses. During college, Brenda was not the type to attend parties or get involved in extracurricular activities. She preferred to focus on her studies and her part-time job, which she got at a small accounting office in the city. The job wasn't glamorous, but it allowed her to gain experience in the field she loved so much. Her boss, an experienced accountant, soon noticed Brenda's natural talent with numbers and began giving her increasing responsibilities. It was at this accounting office that Brenda's life began to change. The company where she worked provided services to several other companies, including a major oil company that was one of the city's top employers. Through this job, she met Richard. He was one of the executives at the oil company, a charming and successful man who quickly caught Brenda's attention. He was not only attractive but also seemed genuinely interested in her. One day, after a work meeting, Richard invited Brenda out. "Brenda, would you like to go to a bar after work?" he asked, with a smile that completely disarmed her. Surprised and a little nervous, she accepted the invitation. That night at the bar marked the beginning of something Brenda could never have predicted. Amid casual conversation and laughter, they discovered a connection that went beyond work. "Have you always liked numbers?" Richard asked, while stirring his drink. "Yes, since I was a child. I've always found it fascinating how numbers can explain almost everything," Brenda replied, smiling shyly. As time went on, Brenda and Richard's relationship deepened. They began to see each other more frequently, and soon what started as a friendship and mutual admiration turned into a passionate romance. Richard, despite having been married once before, seemed genuinely involved with Brenda. He spoke openly about his previous marriage to Helen, a successful businesswoman in the food industry. "Helen is an amazing woman," he would say, with a hint of nostalgia in his voice. "But our marriage didn't work out because she never had time for me." These conversations about Helen, though casual, made Brenda uncomfortable. She knew that Richard still held great respect for his ex-wife and, in some ways, still admired her. Even so, Brenda tried not to let it affect her, as Richard always made it clear that he was now with her and wanted to build a future together. Some time later, Richard and Brenda decided it was time to take their relationship to the next level. "How do you feel about buying a house together?" Richard asked one evening as they were having dinner. Brenda, though surprised, was thrilled by the proposal. They started looking for their dream home, and after a few weeks of visits and discussions, they finally found the perfect place. It was a spacious house in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place Brenda had always imagined raising a family. After moving into their new home, Brenda and Richard's relationship seemed stronger than ever. They began making plans for the future and eventually decided it was time to make their union official. "Let's get married, Brenda," Richard said, holding her hands and looking deeply into her eyes. With her heart racing and tears of happiness in her eyes, she accepted the proposal without hesitation. They set the wedding date and began preparations, with Brenda living the dream of about to marry the man she believed was the love of her life. The wedding preparations took up much of Brenda's time in the following months. She devoted herself to choosing every detail with care, from the dress to the flowers that would adorn the church. Richard, for his part, seemed equally involved and excited about the big day. They spent their nights together, discussing how the ceremony would be, the guest list, and the future they envisioned building in the home they had carefully chosen. "I can't wait to see you walk down the aisle," Richard said one of those nights, while holding her on the couch. "It's going to be the happiest day of my life." Brenda smiled, feeling secure in his arms. "I can't wait either," she replied, her eyes shining with happiness. They were a couple admired by everyone, the perfect combination of love, respect, and companionship. At least, that's what everyone thought. As the big day approached, Brenda's anxiety began to grow. It wasn't that she had doubts about Richard, but there was a restlessness she couldn't explain. "Am I just nervous about the wedding?" she wondered while making the final adjustments to her wedding dress. But she pushed these thoughts aside, convincing herself that everything was fine, that Richard loved her, and that soon they would start a life together as husband and wife. Finally, the wedding day arrived. The morning was sunny, and the city seemed more vibrant than ever. The church was beautifully decorated, ready to welcome the guests who were already starting to gather. Brenda was in her room at the new house, finishing her preparations with the help of her mother and closest friends. The white dress she had chosen so carefully fit perfectly, and the delicate veil completed the image of the bride of her dreams. "You look stunning, dear," her mother said, with tears in her eyes. "I'm so proud of you." Brenda smiled, moved. "Thank you, Mom. This is the day I've always dreamed of." As the final details were being attended to, Richard arrived at the couple's house. He wanted to see Brenda before the ceremony, perhaps to calm her or simply to share a private moment before the big event. They met in the room where Brenda was adjusting the final touches on her hairstyle. Richard entered and, upon seeing her in her wedding dress, was momentarily speechless. "You look beautiful, Brenda," he said, with a genuine expression of admiration. Brenda smiled and approached him, holding his hands. "You look great too, Richard. I can't wait to see you at the altar." Before they could continue their conversation, Richard's phone rang. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket and looked at the screen, where the caller's name seemed to instantly make him tense. "Sorry, I need to take this call," Richard said, releasing Brenda's hands and turning away to answer the call. Brenda watched as he moved a little away, speaking in a low voice. She couldn't make out what he was saying but noticed the worried expression that took over his face. A few minutes passed, and when Richard hung up, he seemed different. The calm and happiness he had shown before were gone, replaced by visible concern. "Is everything okay?" Brenda asked, trying to understand what had happened. Yes, everything's fine," Richard replied, trying to smile but failing. "It was just a work issue, nothing to worry about." Brenda wasn't convinced but decided not to press the issue. Maybe it was just pre-wedding nerves, she thought. Richard quickly said goodbye, mentioning he needed to take care of some things before heading to the church. "I'll see you there," he said before leaving the room, leaving Brenda with a strange feeling, an unease she couldn't quite define. After that phone call, Richard's behavior changed. He was more distant, less present, as if something was deeply troubling him. Brenda tried to ignore these signs, focusing on the final preparations and the guests who were starting to arrive for the wedding. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Brenda arrived at the church on time, and the guests stood in respect for the bride entering, holding her father's arm. She walked slowly down the aisle, feeling her heart race with each step that brought her closer to Richard. But as she advanced, she noticed something strange in his expression. Richard didn't seem the same. There was something in his eyes that made her hesitate for a brief moment. When she finally reached the altar, what should have been a moment of supreme joy turned into a scene of anguish. Richard, who moments before had looked at her with a mix of admiration and nervousness, now appeared distracted, almost distant. Brenda, noticing the change, tried to find comfort in the idea that this was just the natural pre-wedding nerves, but something deep in her heart told her there was more going on. The priest began the ceremony, and everything seemed to follow the carefully planned script. But instead of feeling emotional, Brenda couldn't shake the unease that had settled in since that morning, since the call Richard had received. What had once been a dream come true now felt like a surreal scenario where she was trapped, unsure how to escape. When it came time for the vows, Richard hesitated. He looked at Brenda, and for a moment, it seemed he was about to say something, but he held back. The words that were meant to express the love and commitment they had decided to share didn't leave his mouth. Instead, he stammered, leaving a heavy silence in the air. "Richard," the priest called, gently trying to encourage him to continue. Richard swallowed hard and looked around, as if searching for an exit, a way to escape the situation he was in. Brenda, already in a state of panic, couldn't believe what was happening. Everything felt like a nightmare from which she couldn't wake up. Suddenly, the sound of a ringing cell phone broke the silence in the church. It was Richard's phone. He pulled it from his pocket, looked at the screen for a few seconds, and without saying a single word, turned and ran out of the church. The guests were stunned, unable to understand what had just happened. Brenda stood frozen for a few seconds, paralyzed by shock and disbelief. But soon, reality hit her like a blow. Richard was fleeing, abandoning her at the altar. With her heart pounding and tears beginning to stream down her face, she finally managed to move and ran after him. When she reached the church door, she saw Richard already getting into his car. He started the engine and, without looking back, sped away, leaving behind the bride and all the stunned guests. Brenda screamed his name, but it was useless. Richard was already gone, and all she could see was the car disappearing down the street. Breathless and in shock, Brenda stopped on the church steps, feeling the world crumble around her. Tears streamed freely down her face as she tried to grasp what had just happened. Richard, the man she had planned to spend the rest of her life with, had run away. Without an explanation, without a word, he had simply left her there, humiliated and devastated. At that moment, some friends and family members among the guests began to approach her, trying to comfort her. Her mother, with tearful eyes, rushed to Brenda and enveloped her in a tight embrace. "Brenda, dear, we're here for you," she said, her voice trembling. I can't believe this is happening," Brenda managed to say through her sobs, feeling the weight of the situation crushing her chest. The friends and relatives around her tried to offer words of comfort, but the pain she felt seemed greater than anything they could say. "Let's go home, Brenda," suggested one of her closest friends. "You need to rest, you need to calm down." But Brenda, still in shock, shook her head. I need to be alone," she replied, her voice breaking. "I need to think, understand what happened." Reluctantly, everyone respected her request. With a broken heart, she began to walk alone, leaving behind the church, the guests, and the dreams that had been shattered that day. Each step felt harder than the last, but Brenda felt she needed to be alone, to find a place where she could process the whirlwind of emotions that was overwhelming her. When she arrived at the house they had bought together, the silence that enveloped her felt more deafening than the chaos she had left behind. She entered the house, which now seemed cold and lifeless, a reflection of what she felt inside. She climbed the stairs to the bedroom, the space she had decorated with so much love, thinking it would be where they would start their married life. However, when she opened the bedroom door, Brenda was confronted with a sight that would destroy what was left of her trust and hope. Richard was in bed with Helen, his ex-wife. They were embraced, and the expression on Richard's face was one of pure tranquility, as if the marriage he had just abandoned had never existed. Overwhelmed by a mix of disbelief and pain, Brenda stood frozen at the door, unable to process the scene unfolding before her eyes. Richard, the man she had loved and planned to spend the rest of her life with, was there, in the bed they should have shared as newlyweds, with Helen, his ex-wife. The shock made her body freeze for a few moments as her mind tried to comprehend what was happening. Helen, without even bothering to acknowledge Brenda's presence, continued to hold Richard as if the moment was natural, as if Brenda were invisible. Richard, on the other hand, noticed Brenda at the door and, instead of getting up or trying to explain, merely looked at her with an impatient expression, as if she were simply a nuisance, an unexpected and unwelcome intrusion into his intimacy with Helen. That cold, indifferent look cut Brenda deeply. It wasn't just the betrayal itself that devastated her, but the complete absence of any trace of love or consideration in Richard's gaze. It was as if, with all the plans and dreams they had shared, she meant absolutely nothing to him. "Richard," Brenda tried to speak, but her voice came out in a broken whisper, as if each word was being wrenched from inside her. Yet he did not respond, did not try to explain, nor showed any sign of regret. He merely maintained that icy stare, making her feel completely invisible, as if her presence there was irrelevant. Feeling as if the ground had opened beneath her feet, Brenda took a few steps back, unable to endure the sight any longer. Her heart seemed to be shattering into 1,000 pieces, and the pain was so intense that breathing felt impossible. She turned on her heels and quickly left the room, the door closing gently behind her, as if sealing forever everything she had once believed to be true. Descending the stairs almost automatically, Brenda could not contain the tears that now flowed freely down her face. Every corner of the house, every detail she had chosen with such care, now seemed to mock her. That house, which was supposed to be the home of her dreams, had turned into a place of nightmare. Not knowing where to go or what to do, Brenda grabbed her bag and hurried out of the house, guided only by the instinct to escape that unbearable situation. The city streets, which had always seemed so welcoming, now appeared strange and distant. She walked for a while, directionless, desperately trying to escape the pain that consumed her. Eventually, her steps led her back to her parents' house. In that moment of despair, the only place where she could find any solace seemed to be by their side. When she arrived, Brenda was so emotionally exhausted that she could barely stand. Her mother opened the door, and upon seeing her daughter's state, rushed to embrace her. "Brenda, are you okay?" she asked, her voice heavy with concern. Brenda couldn't respond. The tears spoke for her as she allowed herself to be enveloped in her mother's comforting embrace. Her father, who had also heard the door, appeared in the living room, his face contorting with worry at the sight of his daughter in such a state. He approached slowly, placing a reassuring hand on Brenda's shoulder. With a trembling voice, Brenda finally managed to speak. Richard was with Helen, at our house, in our bed," she said, almost as if confessing an unbearable truth. Her parents, horrified, wrapped her in another embrace. The shock on their faces was evident, but they knew that at that moment, the most important thing was to be by their daughter's side and support her in her pain. After Brenda's devastating revelation, the room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by her sobs. Her parents, still processing what they had just heard, stayed close, trying to offer as much comfort as possible. The pain of seeing their daughter in such a state was almost unbearable, but they knew they needed to be strong for her. "Brenda, sweetheart," her mother began, holding her firmly, "we're here for you. We'll get through this together." Her father, always a man of few words, also tried to find the best way to comfort her. "We'll take care of everything, dear," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, but unable to hide the sadness he felt inside. Feeling the warmth of her parents' support, Brenda managed to calm down a bit, but the pain was still too intense for any words to truly help. She pulled away slightly, wiping the tears that still streamed down her face. "I need to be alone for a while," she said, almost as a whisper. "I need to think, to understand all of this." Her parents hesitated but, respecting her request, nodded their heads. "If you need anything, we'll be here," her mother said, with a concerned but loving look. Brenda went up to the old room where she had spent her teenage years. The space, which had once been a safe haven, now felt small and cramped, unable to contain the enormity of what she was feeling. She sat on the bed, hugging her knees, and let the tears flow again. The images of Richard with Helen continued to haunt her. Every time she closed her eyes, it was as if it was all happening again. The house was silent, allowing Brenda to hear only her own thoughts, which spun around her mind endlessly. How could he do this? She kept repeating to herself, trying to make sense of it all. What went wrong? How did I not see this coming? Questions came, but answers seemed impossible to find. Brenda felt lost, as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet and she was falling into an endless abyss. As the hours passed, physical and emotional exhaustion finally began to take over Brenda. She lay down on the bed, but sleep wouldn't come. All she could think about was what would come next. How to face the future now that everything she had planned was destroyed. How to deal with the betrayal of someone she had trusted so deeply. The next morning, the sunlight coming through the window brought a new sense of reality to Brenda. She sat on the bed, exhausted but with a new determination beginning to rise within her. She knew it wouldn't be easy, that the coming days, weeks, perhaps even months, would be the hardest of her life. But somehow, she had to find the strength to continue. After a shower and getting dressed, Brenda went downstairs to the kitchen, where she found her parents seated at the table. Both had worried and attentive expressions. They hadn't slept much, consumed with concern for their daughter. As soon as they saw her, they stood up to greet her. "How are you, sweetheart?" her mother asked, her voice soft and filled with concern. Brenda took a deep breath before responding. "I'm trying to deal with it," she said, sitting down at the table. "It still feels unreal, like it's all a nightmare I can't wake up from." "I know it's tough right now," her father said, placing a comforting hand over hers. "But you're strong, Brenda. We'll get through this together." Brenda nodded, trying to stay strong, but the pain was still very present. "I was thinking. Maybe I need some time away from here, away from all of this," she suggested. "But before that, there's something I need to do." Her parents exchanged a confused look. "What's on your mind, dear?" her mother asked. Brenda hesitated for a moment, but then said with determination, "I want to sue Richard. He not only left me at the altar but also betrayed me in our own home. This caused immense emotional damage. I can't just let this go." Her father watched her closely, noticing the seriousness in her voice. "Are you sure you want to go down this path, Brenda? A lawsuit can be long and painful." "I know, Dad," she replied, a mix of anger and pain in her eyes. "But he can't get away with what he did. I need to do this, not just for me, but so he understands that his actions have consequences." Her mother, who had been silent until then, nodded slowly. "If you believe this is the right thing to do, we'll support you in everything. You're not alone." Besides, Brenda continued, now with more firmness, the house had security cameras. They probably recorded Richard and Helen entering the bedroom right after he ran from the wedding. Those images could be used as evidence in the case. Her father thought for a moment before nodding. "I'll get in touch with a lawyer. I know someone competent who can help you with this. We'll handle it the right way." Brenda felt a mix of relief and anxiety hearing her father's words. She knew the path ahead would be difficult, but making this decision gave her a sense of purpose, a way to deal with the pain and betrayal she had suffered. She was aware that the lawsuit would be long and fraught with challenges, but she was determined to fight for justice. In the following hours, Brenda's father made several calls until he managed to schedule a consultation with a renowned lawyer in town. He explained the situation, and the lawyer was ready to help Brenda seek the justice she deserved. By late afternoon, they had arranged a meeting to discuss the case in more detail. The next day, Brenda and her parents met with the lawyer in his office. He was an experienced man who listened carefully to Brenda's entire story, analyzing the circumstances and potential evidence. He asked several questions, seeking to understand all the details of the situation, and at the end, he nodded. "Brenda, you have a very strong case here," he said, with a professional and confident tone. "We can sue Richard for emotional damages, public humiliation, and betrayal. The security camera footage from the house will be crucial as evidence. This will not be an easy process, but with this evidence, I believe we can secure significant compensation." Brenda nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope inside her. "I want to move forward with this," she said, determined. "He needs to understand that what he did was cruel and unacceptable." The lawyer explained the next steps, discussing the documents that would need to be prepared and how the process would proceed. By the end of the meeting, Brenda felt exhausted but also more determined than ever. The idea of suing Richard gave her a new focus, something to channel her energy into while she tried to recover from the pain he had caused. In the days leading up to the trial, Brenda threw herself into preparations, determined to see Richard face the consequences of his actions. The process was painful, every detail a reminder of what she had endured, but Brenda knew it was necessary. With the support of her parents and the constant help of her lawyer, she gathered all the evidence she had, including the security camera footage showing Richard and Helen entering the house right after he fled the altar. On the day of the trial, Brenda arrived at the courthouse with her parents and lawyer. She was nervous, but her determination outweighed any hesitation. Upon entering the courtroom, she saw Richard on the other side, sitting with his head down. He looked tired, and the confidence he once displayed seemed to have vanished. Helen, as expected, was not present, since, as Brenda learned later, she had left Richard shortly after that night. The trial began with the testimonies of witnesses who had been present at the wedding. They detailed the shock and humiliation Brenda suffered when Richard fled the altar without any explanation. The security camera footage was shown, displaying Richard and Helen entering the bedroom that was supposed to be where Brenda and he would start their life together. As the evidence was presented, Richard's demeanor became increasingly despondent. He seemed to realize there was no way to escape the consequences of his actions. When it was his turn to speak, Richard stood up and, with a desperate look, addressed Brenda. "Brenda, please forgive me," he begged, his voice broken with guilt. "I deeply regret what I did. Helen, she only spent that night with me and then abandoned me. I was a fool, a complete idiot. I lost everything, please, give me a second chance." Brenda looked at him, her gaze firm and determined. The pain he had caused was still deep, but she had moved beyond it. Richard continued to plead, trying to appeal to any remaining compassion, but Brenda did not respond. The time when she would have been swayed by his words had passed. She would not allow him to manipulate her again. The court, faced with all the evidence presented, ruled in Brenda's favor. Richard was ordered to pay a significant amount in damages for emotional distress, lost the house that was meant to be their home, and his car was also included in the judgment. Furthermore, the news of the trial and the final verdict further tarnished his reputation, resulting in his dismissal from the oil company where he worked. His employers could no longer trust someone who had shown such a lack of character. When the verdict was announced, Richard collapsed, despair clearly visible on his face. He tried to approach Brenda one last time as they were leaving the courthouse, still pleading for forgiveness, but she merely ignored him and moved on. There was nothing more to be said. The past was behind her, and Richard was no longer a part of her future. Brenda left the courthouse with a sense of relief. Justice had been served, and although the pain was still there, she knew she was on the right path to healing. The public humiliation Richard had put her through and the betrayal in her own home had been confronted, and now she could begin to rebuild her life, free from the shadows of that destroyed relationship. As she walked out of the courthouse, the sun shone brightly, illuminating the path ahead. Brenda took a deep breath, feeling the light breeze on her face. She knew the journey of recovery would still be long, but now she was more confident. Life would no longer be defined by that moment of betrayal, but by the strength with which she overcame it. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.